Producer here with some trigger warnings before the episode for violence, blood, gore, monsters, and general horror and Halloween shenanigans. If all of that sounds interesting to you, then please enjoy our horror special. Lift off in 3, 2, 1.
Hello, and welcome back to the Moving Right Along podcast, the podcast by young writers for young writers. We're your hosts, Ruby,
Ray,
Cat, and today we're talking about horror. Just in time for Halloween. It's coming up in 2 weeks.
I'm so excited! I love Halloween!
Yay! And fun fact about today's episode, to get us in the Halloween and horror spirit, our producer Simone has set up a bot that will be scaring us at random points throughout the episode with sound effects. So
As clearly demonstrated just then.
Oh my god!
I was gonna say brace your ears, but it's too late. Yeah, so anyways, speaking of Halloween, do either of you guys have plans for this year? Because I know I'm advocating for me and my sisters to dress up as the Powerpuff Girls, and if you're wondering, I will be Bubbles. I love Bubbles.
That's so in character.
Yeah, I can see that.
Shut up!
I'm not sure what I'm gonna dress up. I mean, I think if I was going by my own worst fear, it would be just my book, just looking at me in the mirror, my own writing. So yeah, I think that would be, maybe that's what I'm gonna dress up as.
Yeah,
Ray?
honestly, I have no clue because I usually have my costume picked out like in May, and I don't know what I'm doing this year. I gotta figure that out.
Yes. I know I will be watching no scary movies. Guys, I'm terrified of everything. Well, actually, that's an exaggeration. I'm terrified of scary movies. But, you know, the horror is just such, like, a big genre, and it's a lot to cover. And I think there's a lot to the genre that we want to talk about a little.
I mean, there's so much to think about when it comes to horror, especially in writing. We can talk about all the sort of historical horror authors like Edgar Allan Poe, Mary Shelley, Bram Stoker, and nowadays, obviously, there's Stephen King, who's churning out a book every 5 seconds that we look away. He's got another book out.
Yeah, I mean, I know I really, like, a lot enjoy writing horror too, but it's more along the lines of, like, ghosts and gore. Like, I love writing paranormal stories because, like, I'm, like, spiritual and stuff, so, like, I'm, like, ghosts and spirits. And I honestly love, like, writing about witchcraft, like, accurately because it's so cool, and I love writing it. I love it. It's iconic.
Yes. So I've written some paranormal stuff as well. So we figured a good way to kind of open up this discussion about horror is we all wanted to talk a little bit about our experiences with writing horror. So for me, similarly to Ray, I haven't really dabbled in the horror field, but I did write a book that was a paranormal. And it took place in New Orleans, / just Louisiana in general, which is, fun fact, one of the most haunted cities in the world. I watch a lot of BuzzFeed Unsolved Paranormal, so if you're out there, fellow fans, it's so good. It's so good. So I really wanted to write just like a story that encapsulates something kind of spooky, but also really fun. And that was my goal with it, and I think I did that. And it was also really important to me because I'm going to talk even a little bit more about this later, but my family is Cajun. I'll explain what that means later as well. And so we're from Louisiana, and there's so much like rich culture there. And a big part of that is the urban legends and the spooky stories and, you know, the voodoo, all that stuff. It's a big deal there. So I've done work with paranormal before, and I love it. So what about you guys?
Yeah, I mean, I really like horror and ghost stories and stuff like that. I especially love sort of gothic horror. I've written quite a few short stories that are very gothic horror. There's something about this sort of creepy mansion in the hills where it's all, murdery and people getting thrown down banisters. It's really fun. But the other part of me that really likes ghost stories is my Malaysian side, because for those who don't know, I'm also going to talk about this a bit later as well, is my mum is from Malaysia. And Malaysia has a very sort of rich history of the supernatural ghosts. The name for ghosts in Malaysia is called hantu, and my mum likes to call me that. But whenever I don't brush my hair, she says I look like a ghost. I definitely find sort of those things very, very interesting. What about you, Ray?
I think I've mentioned this in a past episode before, but I like to write a lot of flash fiction. I especially love writing kind of gory, paranormal ghost, like, kind of short stories. My thing with flash fiction a lot, I kind of write them where it starts off so, like, lighthearted and fun, and then it ends in death, like, really suddenly. It's like, you'll see when I read my story, but,
Oh, thanks for that segue, Ray. As a treat or a trick, for you listeners, we have been challenged by our wonderful scriptwriter Dell, who is our highness of horror. She challenged us to write a ghost story / or incorporate it into your story, share some stories from our cultures and heritage, like spooky stories. So, take it away, Kat, with our first story.
Today I am going to be talking about a horror concept, a ghost story that's actually from, like I said, my Malaysian side. There's a lot of ghost stories in Malaysia. There's a very rich history of ghost stories, especially in what is called the kampung, which is the village, right? And they have all these kind of ghost stories. And today I'm talking about something called a Pentacle. My mum's gonna kill me if I don't pronounce that right. Oh my god!
oh my god!
For a second, I thought somebody was breathing really heavily.
That scared me so bad. When did I tell you I got chills on my spine? Okay, my earbuds out for a second.
Okay. I'm gonna share with you my story. Now that I'm sufficiently freaked out, and for you listeners who don't know, I'm actually recording this at night. It is at night at the moment, so it's pitch black outside, so I'm a little bit freaked out now. So before we start, I'm just going to give you guys some trigger warnings. So trigger warnings for blood, death of infanticide, I think, sort of mild gore, and just general horror shenanigans. This story is called Penanggalan.
To skip this story, go to 11 minutes and 41 seconds.
She smelt of vinegar. That's how you could tell. It overrode the smell of the jungle, the leaves and the humidity, the durians and the mangoes, and replaced it with that sharp smell that tickled at your nose. And as she lay on the floor, organs spilling out across the dirt, we could still smell it. My mother needed help to look after the children, so she hired a midwife. The midwife was beautiful, with lovely long black hair that reached her hips and intricate batik designs on her clothes. Even her smile was nice, the kind of smile that made it feel like the midday sun was warming you up. She was good with the children, especially the newborn babies. In fact, she seemed unusually attentive to the newest born, often clutching her in her arms and not letting go at any point. At night, I heard something coming from under our house. Like most houses in the village, ours were built on stilts, so sometimes you could hear bugs and animals crawling underneath it. Normally I would have thought nothing of it, except I could smell something, a strong, pungent smell. I wrinkled my nose and tried to go back to sleep. But in the morning I woke to the sound of my mother screaming. The baby was gone, snatched away in the middle of the night. I held my mother up as she dropped to the floor, weeping and wailing. We called on the village to help us look for the baby, but we couldn't find her anywhere. Through it all, the midwife helped my mother with the other children, feeding them up and taking care of them. Once night fell, the men of the village claimed that they would protect us and stationed themselves near the door. Though I was uneasy, I fell asleep anyway. But again, I heard a noise from below me. It was a wet, sticky noise, like an animal slurping up water. The smell was back, the smell that made me gag. Even though my mother had told me to stay inside, I couldn't help my curiosity. I hunted down the source of the sound and found it leading to my mother's room. She was whimpering in her sleep, arms outstretched for her lost baby. But her legs were open and something was attached to it. Something that was hiding underneath the floorboards. Unable to help myself, I peered through the slats and saw 2 eyes staring back up at me. The thing was sucking out the blood from my mother, guzzling it down with its long, thin tongue. I screeched, waking my mother up and the rest of the men in the house. By the time they checked underneath the stilts of the house, the thing was already gone. In the morning, however, when the midwife came to visit, I was so scared that I clung on to her for comfort. After all, my mother was out of her mind with grief and terror at this point, and no one else was offering me support. But as my tiny arms wrapped around her, I took a deep breath and smelt it. I recoiled. The midwife stared down at me, and then her lips twisted into a smile. I screamed and the men came running. Before they could catch her, though, she had run off. That night, the village elder advised us to place mengkuang leaves around our house and in between the slats. The mengkuang leaves were sharp and thorny and would catch anything that it touched. This night, I didn't sleep at all. And when the smell came, I heard a scream as the leaves caught on its tongue. The men ran outside, my mother and I in tow, and there we saw her. Except it wasn't a her at all. No, it was just a head with organs trailing out of it. No body attached. The mengkuang leaves had done its job though. The thing had thorny leaves sticking out of its tongue and its guts bleeding out viscous red blood. It didn't take long for the men to kill her. After it was done, I looked down at the body, head. Black hair spilt across the grass, tangled with her guts. One of the village elders called it a pengalan. He said that they were creatures that feasted on infants and new mothers. If we hadn't destroyed it, it would have killed my mother too. We never found the baby, and my mother never truly recovered, but we moved on. When it was time for me to give birth, I begged my husband to place mengkuang leaves around the house. I didn't tell him why. And even to this day, I can't stand the smell of vinegar.
Oh my god, that's so oh my gosh! That was so good! Oh my gosh!
No,
that was
but really, that was
amazing.
amazing.
Yeah.
That was
So
literally
that is
sick. I loved it.
It's a Penanggalan. For those who are interested in the history of it, it's basically a woman who has bathed in vinegar and has performed. But there's a couple of different origin stories. One of them is that she sort of bathed in vinegar to perform this kind of creepy black magic spell, and then a man comes in and startles her, and she turns around so fast that her head detaches from her body, and she was so enraged that she chased after him with just her organs trailing from her head.
Oh my gosh!
Yeah, it's so creepy if you ever see like a picture of it, because it's just a woman's head with like just kind of organs outside of it. It's just,
I'm gonna go
So,
look that up
yeah,
later.
that's-
'Cause I'm...
it's creepy.
Wow.
That's my story, guys. So who's next?
I'm next. Ruby. So for starters, I wrote this story a hot minute ago. So it doesn't have an aspect of culture in it, but I wanted to share briefly about one of my favorite monsters I've learned about from the Cajun culture. So what are Cajuns? Cajuns are these people that migrated from France to Canada to America, and most of them are found in Louisiana, some in Texas, that sort of an area. And it's a really awesome culture full of like a really, oh my gosh, amazing cuisine. If you know gumbo, Cajun seasoning, things like that, those are all from Cajun, and also a mix of also Creole cultures, but I'm specifically talking about Cajun. So it's the culture. And within them, they have these really bizarre legends. And what I wanted to talk about is something called a cauchemar, which I'm definitely saying that wrong. It's a French word. But here's something I found on this website about a first-hand experience from a cauchemar victim, and you'll see what it is. An elderly gentleman by my house said he was sleeping one night, and once Cauchemar pulled on his toes, and another time Cauchemar held him down, jumped on him and held him down, and he was trying to scream for somebody to come help, but Cauchemar did something, and nobody could hear him scream, and he was just holding him down, and until somebody walked in the room because they heard a bunch of noise, going on, and they came and touched him. And he said, when someone else touches you, the spirit leaves, and if the spirit is with you too long, you can die. So basically, a Kaushamar is a spirit that when you're sleeping, it comes, it paralyzes you. And here's where it gets weird. It rides your body like a horse. So basically,
I'm
it
sorry,
makes
what?
you like its pet horse, and it
Oh.
rides you like how, yeah. And so
That
basically,
is
how
so
you can
freaky.
tell if a Kaushamar has visited you is if you wake up and your body's covered in whip marks, because like a horse. Okay. Anyways, that's my fun bit of Cajun folklore for you guys today. Now moving on to my story. So this story is called The Swing. Anyways, you'll see. It's a ghost story. So for trigger warnings, just like death, and just basically everything to do with horror. So just keep that in mind.
To skip this story, go to 16 minutes and 36 seconds.
The swing creaked as it rocked gently in the wind that no one else ever seemed to feel. There had been legends about the swing, told among the town's kids for years and years. The adults all grew up and pretended to forget, but the kids in the town, they knew. A girl, a ghost, a person you couldn't see was rocking the swing. Not the wind, never the wind. All the town's kids would watch from a distance as the rocking would start. It was usually around noon, the hot sun scorching down on the yellowed grass. Every time the kids heard it start, they would squeal. In delight or terror, no one ever knew. Occasionally, they would dare each other to run up and touch the swing while it was rocking. No one ever would. But once, someone did. Terry, he was one of the bigger kids. He ran up and smacked his disgusting fingers onto the swing. He disappeared a few days later. After that, the swing was taken down, the tree chopped down to just a stump. The kids, the adults, everyone heard the crying. The tears of the ghost wet the tree stump, never to dry again. That's the end of my story. It's really short.
Oh, and Ruby, that noise just scared me as well. Whatever came out of your mouth.
That.
That's great.
Anyways, that was my story.
Okay. Well,
I'm getting freaked out. Sufficiently freaked out.
anyway.
What's everyone else doing?
I'm doing okay. On another note, that was really cool, Ruby.
Thank you. It was just like a random ghost story I wrote. It was.
Yeah, but it's
I like
really
it. It's fun.
Okay,
Right.
so my turn. I don't actually really have any cool like legends or anything, but I do have this cool gory story. And speaking of gore, some trigger warnings. Slight gore descriptions, some mention of death, blood, but like not much. So, okay. Here we go. This one, I am actually really proud of this name because I can't name things to save my life. But it's called Flashlights, Friends, An Unexpected End.
To skip this story, go to 19 minutes and 57 seconds.
Okay, my turn now. Ace faced his flashlight upwards to shine on his face, weary shadows casting across his skin and giving the illusion of old age. You're walking through the woods with your best friend. Best friend, I tease. Shut up and let me tell the story, stupid. He sticks his tongue out at me. He says in a husky voice, "You're walking through the woods late at night with your best friend. It's so dark you can barely see his devilishly handsome face 2 feet in front of you. It makes you sad." I snort in mock sarcasm. When suddenly, you step in a pile of poop, and it reeks. "Ew, Ace, what kind of ghost story is this?" I wrinkle my nose at him. "Just wait, it gets scary, I promise." His puppy eyes glare up at me. It better." Like I was saying, he pauses. "You okay?" Ace shines his flashlight in my face to check up on me. "Yeah, it's just this grass. It's disgusting. I can hear it squeak under my boots every time I take a step." "Well, that's monsoon season for ya," he chuckles. "Sure, but is it not usually this mushy? Like this mushy?" As if the grass could hear me, my boot steps in a pile of mud and it shoots upward, splattering me all over. Holy! Ace covers his mouth, surely to keep from laughing. "You've got to be kidding." I wipe off the front of my flashlight, now covered in mud. I hit it a couple times to get it working again, and it flickers on slowly. Anya, Ace was still covering his mouth. Listen, Ace, I get you think this is funny, but the flashlight finally worked, and I could see where my foot was. My scream that should have been let loose froze in my throat. Ace, I turn around and find him gone, his flashlight lying in what I previously thought was mud. It's so dark out, I couldn't even make out what color the mud was I stepped on. I scanned the field around us, and the mud was red. Or rather, the blood was red. Turns out, I hadn't stepped in mud. I'd stepped through bone. Rotting. Human. Bone. And that's it, that's my story.
I feel like I should be used to it now.
I know, after every story.
Accepting it.
Ray, that was so good. You were so good at dialogue.
See, this is what I mean when it starts out fun and then it's like death.
I love that. Oh my gosh, I loved it.
It's really great.
Thank you.
That was awesome.
You freaked me out now, so that's a good thing. I think all those stories were really, really great and very, very scary. I'm very freaked out now. To think that in the past, a group of writers just like us did the exact same thing where they sat around telling ghost stories. If you were ever wondering how the horror classic Frankenstein was made, it was actually made very similarly to this, in which Mary Shelley was hanging out with her husband, Percy Shelley, and a bunch of their other friends, including Lord Byron, and they were coming up with ghost stories, and Mary Shelley came up with Frankenstein, creating the entire genre of sci-fi. So that just goes to show that horror can create even more genres within that section, and it's really, really interesting and very inspiring. And also Dracula, if you're wondering where vampires came from, Dracula by Bram Stoker.
Stephanie Meyer is so grateful. Anyways, ghost stories also were traditionally used to tell kids not to do certain things. So, oh my gosh, I have another fun example from the Cajun culture. This one's more of just like a Louisiana urban legend. There's this thing called grunches. They're it sounds like a breakfast cereal. Anyways, but there's these things called grunches, and they're like these albino creatures that live in the bayou, so like the swamp of Louisiana, and they like eat little children and goats. That's like what they eat. So fun tip, if you ever are driving in Louisiana and you see an injured goat on the side of the road, don't stop to save it. It's a grunch trying to eat you. But that story, unless grunches are real, I don't know, but it's actually been used to keep kids from going and wandering into the swamp on their own, just to keep them out of danger, just because that is like genuinely a danger, like for a little kid to just go wandering through the swamps. And I think that's reflected, we think of like the fairy tales and the classic fables that, like The Boy Who Cried Wolf, Little Red Riding Hood, just like all these different original stories that help teach moral lessons. Horror stories can do the exact same thing, just in a different way.
So, who do you think are the kind of people you need to read if you're going to write some horror, or just some very important figures in the horror writing community?
I would definitely say Edgar Allan Poe. He's really popular, especially nowadays. His prose was always known for like how ominous and like sharp it was. He was very witty with the way he created setting and moved his characters into like these gruesome situations. It just made it so dark and creepy, and his poetry was really haunting as well. I take a lot of inspiration from his works on my own. I love Edgar Allan Poe. We had a whole unit in it for my English class last year, and I was thriving, let me tell you, because it's just so gruesome, and like The Telltale Heart, Annabelle Lee, all of those are just so like twisted, and it's so much fun to read.
Yes. Yeah, so, I mean, definitely Edgar Allan Poe. We love Edgar Allan Poe. He's, like, the classic. Especially with, like, horror short stories, because that's, like, really what he did. That was, like, his forte. The aforementioned Mary Shelley, very critical to understanding the horror genre and its origins. I would say, I mean, this is such a basic answer, but Stephen King is a reflection of modern horror. Even despite whatever feelings you might have about Stephen King's works, I you have to admit he's one of the most popular horror authors, like, ever, if not the most popular. And so I think it's important to look at that to really grasp the state that horror is in today as a genre. Because I think looking back on the classics is a really good way to understand it, but I think, to a certain extent, those are classics. Especially if you're trying to write more publishable horror, it's important to understand the market, which is basically, when you think of horror, you think Stephen King, so...
I definitely agree with both of your guys' picks. I mean, Edgar Allan Poe, The Telltale Heart, definitely a favourite of mine. Very creepy, very, very moving. And also, of course, Stephen King. He is my pantsing. Bringing that back, he is the ultimate pantser. So for that alone, I have to say you should probably read his books. And there's also people like Thomas Harris, who created Hannibal Lecter, and just loads and loads of new horror writers every day. I mean, horror is such a big genre, and it's a very commercial genre. Lots of people love to read horror books, so definitely look up some modern horror writers as well.
Writing with like heavy and darker content, you have to be really smart with it, because you can't always tell what kind of effect it's gonna have without, doing some careful research behind it.
Sorry,
oh my god!
I forgot. Oh You thought that was me? I'm sorry, what? You thought I made that noise? Thanks. Okay, what I was going to say before I got the life scared out of me by us, evil producer now, Simone, is that you have to be really, really careful with way in which you write horror. Just like all the other types of fiction, including YA and children's, like we were talking yesterday, there are a lot of flaws with horror, especially as in the past, and as a lot of the ones we were mentioning, it has been dominated by the straight white man, which obviously leads to some, a little bit of problematic stuff in horror.
I think just because it has its flaws, it doesn't mean, and just because horror is meant to be scary, that doesn't mean that you can't be entertained by it and by a good story with likable characters that you really just get invested in. And really, I think when we take into account the flaws of horror, it really just means that we have to view it with a critical eye. And I think that applies to all forms of writing, but definitely horror as well. And that also just applies to life, honestly. You have to criticize it to understand it and to help make progress, and that includes in the horror genre.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, you really, when you take in content, as a reader or a watcher, just as the audience in general, carefully interpreting it is really smart, actually. You can take away some real good tips from older writers and, the classics, like effective setting, plotting, drafting, and how they, set the scene to be so, like, creepy in horror, You can probably also find what didn't work for them and maybe ask how you would have approached it yourself, Just figure out kind of how you like to write horror, because horror can be very different from writer to writer.
Yeah. Also, I think what is also important to remember is a lot of people like to dismiss horror as only trying to scare people and stuff like that, when in fact most horror has had deeper meanings within it and is used often as allegories for certain things. I mean, in a very, very bad way, in a very not good way. There have been deeper meanings in horror. For example, in H.P. Lovecraft's horror, he was quite a racist. Let's just say he was a very, very racist. Even for the time, other racists said, H.P., you're a little bit too racist for us. And in a lot of his writing, that is actually reflected in that a lot of his monsters represented the fear of the unknown, as in the fear, and more importantly, the fear of sort of basically other races and stuff like that. So yes, there has been, or can have those deeper meanings, though we also need to be critical of what those deeper meanings are, because like I said, H.P. Lovecraft, though he is considered sort of the father of sort of speculative fiction, he was a bit of a racist, and his writing is a bit racist if you look into the sort of deeper meanings about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think when we look at horror, it can really be easy to just look at the surface level of what it is. It's about frightening a reader and making them think. You know, fun and scares, that's the thing. But it can be really easy to downplay and miss the unavoidable point that its roots have been strongly in racism and ableism.
So yeah, so like I was saying earlier with H.P. Lovecraft, big racist, big racist. Also, in a lot of more modern horror films, we often see things like token black character getting murdered off first. I mean, in recent horror films, that's almost become a parody of itself in that people have noticed that the black character gets murdered first. But race and horror have a lot to do with each other. Something that's quite interesting is the sort of modern zombie film was created by George Romero, who made the film Night of the Living Dead in 1968. And a lot of people perceive this film as the psychological response of white America to the civil rights movement, because the zombies are almost seen as, like, the zombies were seen as black people, basically, which, you know, and the sort of the hysteria of the characters in it is seen as basically the white Americans and stuff like that. And you know, it's quite interesting if you ever watch the film to sort of look at it with that lens and see what you kind of think about it, whether you do think that George Romero was being critical of how white Americans were responding to the civil rights movement, or if you think that it had nothing to do with it. There's also been a lot of, in recent years, the reclamation of that sort of use of horror that has been used historically to degrade people of colour and things like that a lot more. Recently, there's been a lot more sort of black authors and other people of colour reclaiming those grounds and writing their own horror stories and things like that. A very, very famous example of that, I mean, I'm sure you guys all know this about Mr. Jordan Peele. He has really, really expanded the horror demographic to include more black voices and things like that. I mean, Get Out was completely groundbreaking for how it told a horror story from a black character's perspective rather than the normal white character's perspective. And obviously after that he also wrote Us, which is also a fantastic film starring black characters and things like that. And Lovecraft Country, he also adapted that for TV. And Lovecraft Country, if you don't know what it's about taking H.P. Lovecraft, who I said earlier was a massive racist, and reworking his stories to describe, basically the moral of the story is that the real horror is white America in the 1960s, basically, is the premise of Lovecraft Country. So this is just some really interesting things about how sort of horror has changed as a genre from being quite a bit racist to being a space where modern people of colour can tell their stories of their sort of, they can tell analogies, allegories of racism and things like that through the lens of horror. So, you know, acknowledge the past, but also acknowledge that horror has that potential to tell those kind of deeper stories using basic concepts like horror and more basic horror concepts. I mean to say more basic horror concepts. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I mean, I think you're so right. Oh my gosh! I knew it was coming, and I still hate it.
I couldn't.
Oh,
Okay.
God.
Okay, I'm okay.
I think you made so many great points in that, Kat, and I think that it kind of just comes down to that people, white people in the past and honestly the present are afraid of what they consider to be different, I guess. And this includes, you know, different races, and I think that's a major root of racism is like this crazy, like, you're different so you're not as good or whatever, which is a ridiculous thought. But I think that can apply to horror and can apply to the genre in that, like, they were like, okay, what's scary to us, what's different? And I mean, let's be real, horror movies are different to reality. So I think you made so many good points about how those two overlap, and they have overlapped far more than they ever should have.
I think that there's any other sort of groups that have historically been mistreated in horror and that you think now are maybe getting their own chance in the horror spotlight?
Yeah, there are, which, you know, kind of brings me to the topic of women in horror. And women in horror have walked a very dubious line between being graphically murdered or blatantly sexualized. I mean, when I think about horror movies, me and Ray were talking about this earlier. The white girl screaming. Like, when we think horror, we think of a white girl screaming. And you know, like the white girl going, "Derek, like, this isn't funny, Derek." Like that, like, stereotype.
That's so accurate.
Where she's like, "This isn't funny. Come out. What are you doing? This isn't
They're
funny."
running and then they fall and oh my god, somebody help me!
And they trip and then they're like limping or like their high heel breaks. And you know, there's so many stereotypes when it comes to women in horror. And the range in character types is pretty desolate and really just leaves room for and has left room for one-dimensional portrayals. And most women in horror stories meet their deaths like almost immediately. And then are also die to help develop another character who is usually male. So I think it's definitely it's been a major issue. Like when you think of like a horror movie, you think of like the opening scene when like the first death happens. And you know, I think of like a white girl, like a white cheerleader or something, like getting murdered when she's like home alone, or like when she strays from the party, or just like things like that. And I think there's so many stereotypes with that. And in regards to like reclaiming it, only recently has horror really started to steer in a newly positive direction of women. And it kind of has kissed those stereotypes goodbye. And a honorable mention of this is Carrie, which came out in 1976, and as well as like newer films like Ready or Not, and Invisible Man, where the main protagonist is a woman, and she's not just like a tool for the plot. She's the one you're rooting for. She's the one you want to survive. These examples end up with the woman that is usually a token female, in the victor's chair rather than 6 feet under.
I think that we are reclaiming it slowly, but there is still a long way to go, because there is just historical things of, especially in horror, and oh my god!
I wasn't ready for that one.
Especially in horror, in both recent horror films and historically in horror literature, the sort of sexualization of brutalized women's bodies, in that often they would go into these long descriptions of dead women after in a horror film, almost sexualizing the dead woman. And I think there's still a lot to do. There's still a lot that we have to do to sort of reclaim that space and make it so that women in horror aren't overtly sexualized, especially their brutalized bodies.
Yeah, that's so true. And I think even in real life, when you think of serial killers, you think of serial killers that largely killed and assaulted women. That was their whole thing. Like Ted Bundy, Jack the Ripper, just all these like infamous ones. That was their target, women. So I think that I wouldn't be surprised if that has influenced the horror industry, and just like viewing women as victims, and not like the ones who can save the day or the ones that will survive, I guess.
Continuing the whole discussion on horror being reclaimed as a sort of liberator for minorities rather than cruel, like cinematic oppressor kind of thing. Queer horror has been forming pretty recently. So there isn't much queer representation in movies, like horror movies and books to begin with. I honestly haven't read one or like watched one that is, except for It, which I'll talk about chapter 2, which I'll talk about a little bit later. But when we do have that kind of representation, it turns into, oh my god, there's a trans character, there's gay characters, oh my god, you're kidding me, I'm so excited. And then, you know, within 2 minutes of being on screen, they get brutally murdered. Like, that's not representation, that's just homophobia. But I can think of one, actually, I can't really think of many movies that are doing this pretty well, but a movie that was kind of pretty progressive in the sense of queer representation in horror was Alien from 1979. Relevant to us here, writers, the original script of the movie was written so that each character didn't have like a determined gender. You didn't know like the character's literal the script just didn't state it. And when it kind of was created this way, this gender neutral script pretty much eliminated, intentional like mistreatment of a female character, and it kind of normalized the situation in which gender wasn't explicitly male or female. Still, again, it wasn't like, oh my god, there's actually like a, I don't know, non-binary person in a horror movie, but it did something. It did something. And I think horror has definitely come a long way, and it's definitely getting there. We do have a long way to go, but it's doing better. It's doing better.
There is one thing I could think of that I know it's not a movie, but it is still writing a screenplay written. Is that isn't Stranger Things considered horror? And doesn't in the second season it has a is it second season or third season? One of the characters comes out as lesbian.
Yeah, you're right.
So you
Robin.
there we go.
Yes,
We got
Robin.
one.
Oh my god, I love Robin. Okay, is this a spoiler? Does this count as a spoiler? But in one of the scenes, one of the main characters, her name is Robin. Go Robin. Comes out as queer. Actually, yeah, queer. I don't think she actually used the label, but yeah, I think queer people in horror definitely have started to kind of get their footing. We definitely still have a long way to go, but there's that. And another thing I want to talk about is witchcraft in horror, because a huge part of the horror genre is based on witchcraft and the demonization of it, and kind of considering it like this. Devil worshipping. Devil worshipping. But a huge part of horror genre, you can see a lot of horror movies that are kind of centered around the fact that there's these, I don't know, group of women performing witchcraft and they summon a demon. The thing with having these kinds of witch characters in these films is that, and writing obviously, is that it demonizes the practice of witchcraft. And if you don't know, witchcraft actually isn't devil worshipping. Fun fact. And it really gives witches a bad name if we didn't have one already. And it kind of creates this idea in people's mind that, oh, like, don't mess with witches, they'll kill you, or like, they'll summon a demon and they'll hex you, or things like that. And obviously, dark magic does exist. People do practice dark magic. But it's not all of witchcraft. There's good things to witchcraft. And one of the things that I think is a perfect example of this is the Pentacle. And if you don't know what that is, it's that star in the circle. I don't know why I just did it in the air. You can't see that. But it's a star in a circle. And it's used a lot, like a lot, in horror films to kind of be scary and intimidate and give fear into this audience. But in reality, the Pentacle, actually, a little lesson in witchcraft for you right now, the Pentacle actually symbolizes protection. You use it to protect yourself from, ironically, you use it to protect yourself from spirits. And in fact, people call it, like the Devil Star a lot, not only in horror films, but in life as well. When in reality, the Devil Star is actually a flipped pentacle, so an upside-down star in a circle. And that's what's used to summon demons, not the actual pentacle that's good and used for protection. But the problem with having these kinds of demonized witches in horror is that it gives, like I said before, it really gives witches a bad rep. So that's my spiel about witchcraft in horror. I think we haven't really reclaimed it yet, but I'm waiting. I read a really great sort of horror book called, I'm reading it right now, actually. I didn't finish it, but it's called A Lesson in Vengeance by Victoria Lee, and it's an accurate representation of witchcraft so far, so I would read that. But, yeah. On writing horror, it's, mainly smart to kind of find a balance to provide more detail. Like, a setting is complete with descriptors to, like, help us visualize what's going on, and too much description and the readers can be like really overwhelmed, and too little of a description and we're just kind of, we don't know like what's going on in this scene.
Yeah. And I think fear of the unknown is referenced in the nuances of horror extremely often. It goes back as being defined by the wariness and distrust of strangers or foreigners. And now it can be used to capture a broader definition of the overall just things that are unfamiliar.
Yeah, I mean, talking about things that are unfamiliar, one of the big tenets of horror fiction is the sort of when something is very similar to a human, but is slightly different, and that becomes very, very creepy. So it's called the Uncanny Valley theory, which basically says that if something looks very human, but there's something slightly off about it, we will perceive that as creepier than something that is straight like completely different. So for example, we might perceive something that, for example, a huge wolf that's supposed to represent a werewolf as less creepy than a doll that looks human-like, but obviously it's a doll, so it's made out of plastic. We find things like dolls very creepy, sort of androids we find very creepy, things that look human but have a slightly different, you know, Slender Man is another example of those. For anyone who's never watched Slender Man thing, it's basically a humanoid person, but he's been stretched out like that. So things like that, if you're interested in writing horror, I would say definitely look up the Uncanny Valley theory and basically investigate that and maybe try incorporating it into your own stories, because it is a really great way to sort of examine how we as humans find things that look humanoid but aren't really creepy, and it's a great way to freak out your audience.
Yeah, and just keep in mind with writing horror that the goal is to tell a story over firstly scaring your audience. And though scaring is necessary to really make a horror story, you still need a story at the core of it. And a scare really means nothing if it comes out of nowhere. And it makes no sense within the plot and is just there for shock value. That doesn't have as much power to it, and as much, it won't resonate as much with your readers. And the meaning and fear can escalate if it's connected to the characters or their backstory.
Yeah, and as fun as the typical suspects are, like being vampires, werewolves, witches, warlocks, etc., all that fun monster stuff, experimenting with new ideas for hauntings in like a paranormal realm is a great way to stretch your brain and kind of test the limits of your imagination. You know, if a certain idea takes you by surprise, it could be a fun test to write it down and just, oh my god.
No! We were so
There's a lot of things you could do with paranormal. You know, it's not really a defined kind of suspect thing. But you may not be able to chase ghosts and hunt monsters, but your characters definitely can.
Finally, whether your plot is set in our world or a different dimension entirely, taking the set of rules by which we live and bending them can help foster a disorientating setting with unfamiliar characters, instantly pulling readers in if done well. Writing is a tool to explore and reflect. There's an endless repertoire of genres out there. Horror isn't talked about as much as romance, sci-fi, or fantasy, but it's deserving of the same interest and retrospection those stories get. For this episode's challenge, we want you to try writing something scary. That's the only rule, and it's broad for a reason, to give you creativity and artistic freedom to explore the horror genre.
You don't need to scare yourself or anyone at all. The only people that really need to be scared are your characters in the narration, and by doing that, it'll translate to your readers. Celebrate this October by trying something new.
And that's all on our little horror special, or our little crash course on horror. So, happy, or should I say haunting writing. And that's all for now, writing cadets. We'll see you on our next adventure.
Oh my god! Oh my god! We've done the episode. Come on,
Thank you for listening to the Moving Right Along podcast, made possible by the Young Writers Initiative. Tune in next week where we talk about the scariest thing in November, National Novel Writing Month. You can follow us on Instagram at Moving Right Along Podcast or find us on tywi.org. And while you're there, why not submit to our chapbook and manuscript contest that has been extended until October 31st. And there's always fun events going on over on our Discord, The Writer's Town. Thank you to our team without whom this wouldn't be possible. Our Highness of Horror, Dell, Your Best Nightmare, Cassette, Rutro, It's Jasmine, and That Meddling Kid, Simone. All sound effects are taken from the Free Sound Project, and all music is from filmmusic.io by Kevin MacLeod. Today you heard Beauty Flow, Medusa, Phantasm, and Very Low Note.